So we're getting ready for another MMA card on Saturday. Strikeforce in St. Louis, and Kevin Iole is here to break down the MMA card. Kev, good card. Action fights, but it lost a little star power. And, again, a challenge for Scott Coker to keep a card together with some of those guys who dropped off.
Yeah, it's always tough when you don't have the depth like the UFC has, Steven. Certainly it's not a big deal losing Herschel Walker from the standpoint of, hey, that was going to be a great fight. It was just a name that's going to bring people in. The fan that maybe, even a casual fan, that's just a person that hears Herschel Walker on a commercial or something, says, oh, I want to, catch this. But I think it's a good deep card. The Dan Henderson fight I'm interested in. There's a couple fights on this card that I think, should be, Paul Daley and Scott Smith should be very entertaining. So, I think they've done a good job taking advantage of the matchups that were available to them and putting the fights together. I think this is going to be one that if you happen to be at the Ultimate Fighter card, make sure you get the DVR working and get that Showtime card, because I think it's going to be an entertaining one.
Bigfoot Silva lost the older Overeem brother, Valentin, and Mike Kyle's going to step in. So you got a big size disparity there, probably 265 against 225. I guess my only problem with that fight is, and it's indicative of the whole heavyweight situation right now, and Scott Coker's struggle making these fights. I think they've got a really good roster of heavyweight fighters, and yet they can't match the guys up.
Number one, I think part of that is caused by Fedor, because his management team is so difficult to work with. Fedor is not like the average fighter that you have on your roster. You say, hey, we're going to have you fight this date, this time against this opponent. Everything with Fedor is like these, long negotiations, these drawn out things. So, one of the guys that everybody wants to see is Fedor, and so everybody's waiting to fight Fedor, and as a result, that kind of ties a lot of things up. It's unfortunate, but also that, then you have their champion, Alistair Overeem, who's also fighting in K1. So, when you have maybe your two most recognizable and your two top guys that, are not always 100% accessible, to be situations that are going to occur like this.
The fight itself, Kyle and Silva, does Mike Kyle have a chance? I mean, there's a lot of size there, and it's not like Silva's some, big lumbering guy who can't strike.
Yeah, Steve, I've learned, enough. I've been burned enough times. We're saying this guy has no chance. In MMA, everybody has a chance. Basically, I think the only two people on the planet in an MMA fight that don't have a chance are you and I. But beyond us, hey, Mike Kyle is a trained professional. He has a chance. Do I expect him to win? No. I expect Bigfoot Silva to walk all over him, really, and come out with a stoppage in this fight. He's an elite guy. He has to prove he's an elite guy, and I think he'll do that with Mike Kyle.
Scott Smith is on this card, and he kind of represents what the card is all about, and that's action fighters. He's down at 170 now. He's going against Paul Daley. You have an issue with Paul Daley being back on a major card this soon?
Well, he was suspended in Montreal after taking a cheap shot at Josh Koscheck, and Dana White booted him from the UFC and said he would never come back. Maybe that's a little harsh, saying he's never going to come back, but certainly, I don't like the fact that Daley, he's fought twice. He fought in Australia on a card. He fought on a Shine Fights card. Basically he was penalized, and then he just said, screw the penalty, and he's fought. So, if he had stayed out for, say, 6 months or 3 or 4 months, I'd say, okay, you know what, he served his time, and these guys, aren't going to get life sentences just for one stupid mistake that they make. But he kind of flunked like that. But what I do like, Steve, is the matchup. I think this is a terrific matchup, and this is going to be one that, if any fight on that card, you're going to go, wow, it's that Daley Smith fight.
All right. So your pick in the fight is?
I like Daley. I just, there are too many variables with Scott Smith. And Scott seems to, he's a good guy and he's got heavy hands, but he always seems to do just enough to lose. He's a guy that, a number of years ago when he was in the WEC fought at light heavyweight, so he's a big guy. And now he's cutting down to 170. I don't know how that's going to affect him. I just can't imagine that he's going to be effective at 170 like he was at 185. Daley is a bigger welterweight. He's actually had trouble making 170 himself on occasion, so I don't think there's any issue with him, being outmanned by size in this fight. I think Daley's a better striker, and I think this fight, if Daley gets to the ground, then he's in big trouble, but Scott Smith isn't really the guy that's going to take him there. So, I think this is going to be a stand-up fight. I think Paul Daley will win this one. I expect him to win it by stoppage.
I think interesting questions in the top two fights on the card in terms of what guys have left. Number one, Matt Lindland. He's 40 years old now. Obviously, he's a takedown specialist. Does he have the explosiveness, the technique to get Robbie Lawler to the ground and avoid Lawler's punches? Because obviously, if he stands with Lawler for very long, he's going to get knocked out.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that that's a great assessment, Steve. I mean, got very, very heavy hands. I give Lawler credit for his fight, the fight he had with Babalu in the summer. It wasn't like he was getting taken down repeating that fight. So he showed pretty good takedown defense there. It's a whole different story with Matt Lindland. You're talking about a world-class wrestler here. I like Lawler in the fight. I just think he brings a little more to the table. I think he's a little fresher than Matt is. Matt certainly has to be careful because Robbie Lawler can knock him out with anything. I think if Matt's going to stand on his feet, he can win a fight on his feet, but he's really got to be technically perfect. And I think more often than not, he's not technically perfect. That's why I'll go with Lawler.
Dan Henderson in the main event against the aforementioned Babalu. Tough call on both of these guys. Babalu hasn't looked scintillating in his recent fights, and obviously Henderson got thrown around like a rag doll by Jake Shields, but also claims that he was kind of beat up going into the fight and had a bad weight cut.
He's never complained about weight cuts before, so I was a little surprised saying that, to be honest with you, Steve. But I'll say this, and at the risk of getting harassed if I'm wrong, but I think this is a Dan Henderson fight easy. I really do. I just think that the way he matches up, and I think he's going to be hungry. He's going to know this is one of his final chances at a really big fight if he doesn't win. And, if he gets drilled in this fight, then all of a sudden, where does he go? So I think he's prepared. I think, he's got the style, and I expect Dan Henderson to really put on a vintage Dan Henderson performance here, beat up Babalu, and win a very convincing victory.
So before we let you go, I did want to ask one thing, and I'm only going to do this once every 6 months. Are you hearing anything? We mentioned Fedor earlier in the piece. Are we hearing anything on Fedor? He hasn't re-signed yet. Is there an opening for an exit to UFC? Well, what do you hear?
I think he's going to re-sign with Strikeforce. I just think that's where the comfort level with his management team is. I think the fans need to understand that Fedor pretty much divorces himself from contractual situations. He concerns himself with fighting and with being in shape and working with his Red Devil fight team, but he's not a guy that's really getting too heavily involved in the contract talks. So M1 is involved in that. I think their comfort level is much better with Scott Coker. Steve, I think the stars are really aligning to bring him back to Strikeforce. They need him more than the UFC needs him. The UFC is going to be successful with or without Fedor. The heavyweight division, a lot of it in Strikeforce revolves around Fedor. They want to put that big rematch on Fedor against Verdum, the first guy to beat Fedor in 10 years. So that fight's going to be a huge fight when Strikeforce puts it on. They also want to match Fedor up with Overeem and see if they can make a big fight out of that. So there's two really big fights for them right there. And then who knows down the road about Bigfoot Silva, what he keeps doing. So I think, the way things are working, to me, it looks like Strikeforce, the comfort level with the M1 is better with Strikeforce than UFC. I think Fedor, really wants those fights. So as a result, I expect him to be back with Strikeforce in 2011.
All right, Kevin, enjoy the fight weekend. We'll check in with you next week.
Definitely look forward to it. Thank you, Steve.